It's a long way to Tipperary, it's a long way to go, it's a long way to Tipperary.
I'm here in Leeds to talk to Professor Peter Simkins, President of the Western Front Association. Peter, perhaps you'd like to start by telling us how you got started as a military historian.
Yeah, it's really a chapter of accidents, as if fate took a guiding hand. In my other life, I'm a jazz musician, and the reason I selected King's College London as my university was because that enabled me to remain at home in London suburbs and still play with the jazz bands that I played with. So there was no plan in that except my jazz interests. I read history at King's College London. On the first morning as an undergraduate, we were told to queue up outside Professor Williams' office, and we were given a list of special subjects which we should choose one, which we would pursue over the next 2 or 3 years. And as I scanned the list, there were things like fishing in medieval Grimsby and church and state under Henry II. And I looked with increasing depression down this list to the economic consequences of the Black Death. And finally, at the bottom, it said War and Military Organisation in the West, 1850 to 1945, or something similar to that. I thought, well, that'll do. I've read the Dam Busters and a few other war books and a couple of military biographies, so that might give me some interest. Well, the reader in war studies or military history at King's at that time was Michael Howard, Professor Sir Michael Howard, as he now is, arguably the most distinguished military historian of his generation worldwide. Brilliant lecturer, brilliant tutor, and I was lucky enough as one of the few people, I think there were about 5 or 6 of us opted for the military history option. And studying under Michael Howard after about a year, I thought I want to be like him.
Tremendous. So it seems almost random that you stumbled into military history rather than fishing off Grimsby, which is quite fortunate for all of us.
I could well have become a medievalist, but I didn't. So that's how it got started. The second chapter of that chapter of accidents was the fact that when I graduated in 1961, Captain Sir Basil Littlehart was deciding to bestow, after his death, his whole collection of papers and library upon King's College, who therefore needed a young archivist to go down and help begin the process of sorting the papers out prior to their eventual transfer. And I just happened to be around at the time, and Michael Howard wrote to me and said, "Peter, would you care to take this on? It won't be much money in it, but it'll be a good opportunity."
And Basil Littlehart was a subaltern on the Somme in 1916 with the 9th King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry.
He was indeed, yes. And later, after the war, helped rewrite the infantry training manual under one of my First World War heroes, General Sir Ivor Maxey. So that there was a First War connection there. At the time, I didn't really exploit it fully because Littlehart's correspondence was, I think, probably more geared towards the interwar and Second World War periods. So I also had to catalogue a lot of papers about tank warfare in the desert and the views of German generals, British military policy on mechanisation after the First World War, etc. So although I was involved in First World War history at Littlehart's, it didn't dominate my life there.
And was Littlehart, is it true to say Littlehart was a massive gossip and was one for anecdotes?
Yeah, Little Heart's working methods were very interesting. He was a great collector of information. If somebody rang him up during the day or evening, he would always have a notepad by the phone. And it might be, for instance, a Minister of Defence or somebody like columnist Cassandra of the Daily Mirror, who was very well known at that time. It might be a historian like Barry Pitt or Corelli Barnett, and he would have a notepad by the phone, and he would make notes, and the notes would be headed "Conversation with Corelli Barnett, 12th of May 1963." And then he would, if it was an interesting conversation, he would get his typist to type up, say, 50 copies the next day of notes for history, as he called them. Then he would send those out to 50 people who he thought might be interested. And so there was a mass of this sort of duplicate correspondence in the files, all of which had to be sorted as well. Some of it was gossip, some of it was fundamental information, some of it was comments on books like John Terrane's The Educated Soldier, which was just appearing about the time I was down there, it had just appeared. And so you got massive views on almost every aspect of defence policy, history, and so on. And being exposed to this was a fantastic experience for a year and a half.
And after that you went on to the Imperial War Museum?
I did, yes. It was quite clear that the amount of time needed to catalogue and organise the Little Hut papers had been totally underestimated. And I thought it was going to last about 10 years, which it did. Indeed, one of my later IWM colleagues, Stephen Brooks, was doing my job at Little Hearts many years after I'd left. So eventually a career, I thought, well, I've got to do something else before I sort of vegetate, just being Little Hearts archivist. And job was advertised as Research and Information Officer at the Imperial War Museum in 1963. And I applied for that and got it. It helped that Michael Howard was on the interview board, perhaps.
And that was a 36-year career with the IWM?
Yeah, just under 36 years. For 2 years I was duly Research and Information Officer. Second period from 65 to 76 I was Keeper of Exhibits, which meant that I was responsible at the top of that department for everything from British Cat Badge of the First World War to Gloucester Javelin fighter, and also for the display of almost everything. So it was a demanding job, but it was a great experience again. Particularly in helping to build up the IWM's collections of exhibits which somehow I had missed out on. A P-51 Mustang fighter, Soviet T-34 tank, those sort of things, and eventually HMS Belfast.
So would you classify HMS Belfast as one of the high spots of your career within the IWM?
Well, I think certainly in terms of audacious ideas and in terms of conquering a lot of obstacles. It wasn't a personal achievement in the sense that I did it on my own. That was very far from the case. It needed a hell of a lot of hard work by a lot of people, and it was a great team effort. But I think I was one of the people that when we first saw HMS Belfast in the late 60s at Portsmouth, and probably under the influence of a rather lengthy lunch in the wardroom with the Admiral of the Reserve Fleet and some pink gins and port and so on, we were shown around the ship, and we'd been looking to preserve a 6-inch turret from a derelict cruiser called HMS Gambia to go with the 15-inch guns on the lawn of the Imperial War Museum. Somebody suggested the cruiser armament would accompany these. And on looking at Gambia, we were entertained on board Belfast, which was then still in commission, having looked round a working ship with everything from a chapel to bakeries and sick bays and so on. I think I said, well, so much for a derelict sort of 6-inch turret, let's have a go at preserving a whole warship. And the director at the time, Noble Frankland, gave my department the go-ahead to look into it, to produce a feasibility study, which was one of the main ingredients in the project. And we were very proud to see it as part of the London landmarks from the early 70s onwards. But there were other highlights, such as opening up Duxford to the public, which was also a derelict airfield in the late 60s, having been used in the feature film The Battle of Britain. And we opened that up, and now that's one of the biggest air museums in the world, and a home for many of the IWM's collections of all sorts of things. In the 80s, we helped to reopen the Churchill's Cabinet War Rooms, which was another highlight. So that, I can look back physically on things at the IWM, things which are now part of the museological framework of Britain, and say, yeah, I was involved in that.
That's excellent. And the part of your career at the IWM involved writing your magnus opus of Kitchener's Army.
Yeah, in 76, I had a change of sort of direction within the IWM owing to sort of internal factors in the museum at the time, and I was called after that the museum's historian, which implied that there weren't any others, but there were some excellent people in the building, such as Peter Hart and Bryn Hammond and others, but that was the title I bore, and it put me back on an academic track, which is what I'd originally joined the museum to be. And as part of that process, I was asked or instructed, directed would probably be a better word, to produce a monograph. And
how was that long in the writing and researching?
Yeah, it was a long time. It was about 8 years, in fact, because I was doing many other things at the time, dealing with the public and helping with exhibitions and so on. So it wasn't a sort of every day I was doing nothing but researching Kitchener's Army. The reason I chose Kitchener's Army as a subject was, again, an accident. Barry Pitt was editing Purnell's part work, History of the First World War, and rang me up. It was somebody I met and knew from Little Heart days, and Barry said, look, I'd like somebody to write on Kitchener's first 100,000. I said, well, I don't really know much about that, but I'll have a bash. And I then got fascinated by the recruiting side, the social history side of recruiting Britain's army in the First World War, and therefore that led me to choose Kitchener's Army as a project.
Fascinating that we all perceive you as an operational historian, but the Kitchener's Army crosses the boundary and is very much a social history as well.
Well, one thing led to the other, because in researching Kitchener's Army, I came across Kitchener divisions such as the 18th Division, which in people's memoirs and letters and so on, people kept saying, well, this is a jolly well-trained division, and our GOC, Ivor Maxey, is a first-class trainer of troops, etc. And this fascinated me. And then when I began to look at the sort of operational performance of that division on the Somme, it was one of those which did best. And I began then to think, well, what makes a division perform well or badly, and so on. And that's what led me on to being an operational historian. And there was a crossover. There was a sort of moment on the road to Damascus at this stage, because when I rediscovered Ivor Maxey and the 18th Division being operationally successful, this ran totally contrary to what I'd been taught by Little Hart, who regarded, as one of the people who created or helped to create the image of the British Army in the First World War as incompetent and not terribly progressive. And I began to doubt Little Hart's gospel, and became an independent-minded historian for the first time in the sort of late 80s.
So that's quite interesting, that following from your first career with Little Hart, you changed by 180 degrees in terms of your outlook on the First World War.
Little Hart's legacy to me was very much, he taught me how to think properly. His own nagging away at quite almost inconsequential details to get at the truth was a good example. Whether he came up with the right answers is quite another matter, and looking back and knowing as much about the Great War as I now do, I regard a lot of what Little Hart wrote as tosh nowadays, but that doesn't alter my affection for him or my gratitude to him as a kind of stimulator of thought. And one of the things I used to do at Little Hart, so in fact I had to do as part of my job, was after dinner in the evenings was often to sit down and chat with him in his study until after midnight on some occasions, fortified by a glass of scotch or two, and discuss military history. And that was like a sort of seminar, which I kind of applied the thought processes I learnt there in the 80s and 90s. I say, though it took me in a completely different direction to Basil, I owe him that much at least.
Super. And the Western Front Association came along in the early 80s, in 1981 to be precise. Were you an early member of the WFA?
I wasn't an early member, but I was very much an early lecturer on the WFA circuit. I also began to work as a battlefield guide for Holt's tours, who were probably the major battlefield tour company by the mid-80s, and therefore I was became a public face. I began to appear at more WFA branches, and then decided, well, I jolly well better join, as well as lecturing to branches. At the same time as doing Holt's tours, and at the same time I was involved in quite a stimulating sort of First War school of historians almost at the IWM and elsewhere. So there was very much, from about 1985 onwards, there's got resurgence of interest on all fronts in the Great War, WFA being one strand of that.
Do you feel that your involvement with the Western Front Association was part of the revisionist movement that came along in the 1980s and 90s?
Yes, I think it was. I mean, one of the things which in that period, late 80s, early 90s, was the fact that I began personally to realise that my views were beginning to coincide very much with John Terraine, one of the great presidents of the WFA, and I began to get to know John much better as a result of that, particularly through a series of lunchtime seminars held at Brass's, the publishers, where people like Gary Sheffield, Keith Simpson, Brian Bond and others used to foregather. There were the seminars Tuesday evenings at the Institute of Historical Research in the University of London. Again, Brian Bond and others were, Brian Holden Reid, people like that very much involved. There were activities including conferences at Sandhurst where there was a very strong team with First World War people like Paddy Griffith, Ian Beckett and John Keegan, etc. at the time. Then there was a group of historians, Ed Spears and John Gooch here at Leeds, and a team at the IWM, which also had sort of satellites, people like John Lee and Andy Simpson. Within the museum there was Mike Hibbard, Chris McCarthy, Laurie Milner, myself, Brad King, all of whom had an interest in aspects of the First World War. And all these, what I would call centres of excellence in the 90s, began to coalesce and cross-fertilise, and there's a very stimulating period, which I think is when the sort of idea of the BEF's learning process in the First World War was really examined in detail for the first time, and lots of wonderful research was done by a lot of very clever people. And I think the WFA was very much an element in that. One of the main threads running through the whole thing.
So you retired from the Imperial War Museum in 1999, but that was not the end of your academic career?
No, about a month before, my great friend and colleague, Dr. John Bourne of the University of Birmingham, with whom I'd become quite closely associated in the 90s, as one of, John was really director of one of the other centres of excellence, if you like, in Great War Studies. And about a month before I retired, John wrote to me and said, would you consider becoming an honorary professor in modern history at the University of Birmingham? And I think I was sort of slightly surprised by this, delighted, of course, because it gave me an interest after retirement and something really solidly academic to become involved in. I think I questioned John. I said, am I entitled to call myself professor? And John's reply was typically unpretentious. Well, I wouldn't have suggested the bloody thing if I wasn't serious. So that began a happy relationship, working relationship with John, and later with Gary Sheffield, who I'd known since he was at Leeds in the early 80s. And I helped, I think, in some small way to develop the MA course in British First World War Studies at Birmingham, which was a success, and of which you were one of the early stars.
I wouldn't go quite so far as that, but certainly there has been quite a number of Western Front Association members who have participated in the MA course at Birmingham and also latterly at Wolverhampton.
Well, there's now a very happy team at Wolverhampton, to which I would add the names of people like Steve Badsey and Spencer Jones, and some very healthy MA classes there, and the future at Wolverhampton looks, for the war studies there, I think looks particularly bright and in very safe hands under Gary. So I think there's no doubt that the sort of level of research that we built up in the 90s and early noughties will be sustained and built upon.
Would you agree that the wider dissemination of the dissertations that come out of Birmingham and Wolverhampton and other universities would be a good practical step of ensuring that this learning process continues?
Yes, I think anything that avoids the sort of dissertations just getting stuck in some cyberspace or on the bookshelves of a university library. I mean, I personally supervised 2 or 3 quite outstanding people who taught me a hell of a lot. I was supposed to be supervising them, but I had the occasion only last week to re-examine, not in the academic sense, but to look again at one of these dissertations, and I thought, my God, what an outstanding piece of work that was. Yes, I fear that it might have somehow, though it's referred to in 1 or 2 footnotes in academic books, it hasn't got really the audience it probably deserved in terms of quality of research. But at the same time, I would argue that the level of quality of journals such as Stand 2, if you look at the standard of articles and the amount of footnoting and source references at articles in Stand 2, it's quite different from the early days, and I think it's one thing we can be very proud of. I think Stand 2, for instance, is an outstanding example of a good academic journal which is also highly readable.
2016 obviously sees the anniversary of the Battle of the Somme. How do you perceive that this will be portrayed in the press at large and television in particular?
I have great fears about the way the Somme is going to be portrayed in the media at large. I think we're going to see a great concentration on the disasters of the 1st of July. A lot about the PALS battalions and the carnage of their baptism of fire on the Somme. I fear we're not going to get a sort of overall picture of the battle, which lasted considerably longer than one day. I think there's been a lot of important work done on the Somme, academically and in good popular history. But I fear, I may be proved wrong, and I hope I am, but I fear that the media will snatch at the usual sort of cliches of the First World War, and that Blackadder will rear his ugly head again, and all that sort of thing. I think one of the roles that the WFA can usefully play is to try and point out that there are many other facets to the Battle of the Somme, apart from the 1st of July, which I have in the past described as the tyranny of the 1st of July, in as much that it tends to sort of occupy our attention to the exclusion of what the lessons of the Somme were. If you look at what the BEF did in early 1917 to reorganise itself and make itself into a more effective fighting force, it's quite clear that the Somme was a fundamental part of this learning process, which enabled us to play a major part in winning the war. So I don't regard the thing as entirely negative, but I fear the media will succumb to the usual butchers and bunglers and death of innocents on the fields of Picardy and all the cliches which I've striven for the last 20 years or so to avoid.
Thank you very much indeed, Peter, for talking to us today.
Well, can I just add, David, thank you very much for inviting me, and also can I add what a privilege and an honour it's been to be president of the Western Front Association since 2011. It wasn't something I ever expected to be, but I'm absolutely delighted to be president, and I hope that I can repay the association in some way over the coming years.
It's been a privilege, Peter. Thank you very much.
It's a long way to go. It's a long